Continuing our reading in Abraham Hannibal and the Battle for the Throne by Francis Summers Cox. Today is chapter 11, Tsar Peter the Great, and the date is January to April, the year 1707. It was a clear and sunny day, though very cold. The sledges swept along the ice of the Moscow River, and suddenly far ahead Abraham saw something gleaming in the sky. And as they came nearer, he saw it was tall white towers with shining tops like onions made of gold, and below them great white balls that plunged right down to the river banks. They turned away from the river and scraped their way through one of the city gates, along snowy streets paved with logs of wood and lined with little wooden houses, cheerful with carved decorations round the windows and roofs, until they came to a great open square full of market stalls and goods and merchants and horses and camels and donkeys, and the confusion and din of buying and selling. At one end was the strangest church, a forest of red towers with bright scaly roofs in half a dozen colors, some shaped like onions, some like twisted turbans of the Muslims. In front of them were more high white walls crowned with towers, and behind the walls, the white towers with golden tops that Abraham had seen from far away. They were let in through a huge gate, and at last into the royal palace, where their filthy clothes and boots, wet with melted snow, were taken away, and they all had a chance for a hot steam bath, just like the ones Abraham used to have in the Sultan's palace. At last they were all kitted out in new, fresh, clean clothes, and Fatty Sava and some palace officials took the boys to be presented to Tsar Peter the Great, except that they were taken into a carpenter's workshop instead. Abraham and Seki looked around in bewilderment. There were all kinds of fancy drills and saws and beautiful complicated things made or half made in wood. In a corner, hunched over a model of a sailing ship, was a messy-haired man in dirty jacket and knee breeches. In fact, there were two model sailing ships, one finished that seemed to be in the making, copying the other. "Your Majesty," began one of the officials, "I have the pleasure of presenting—" The man with the ships jumped up and roared, "What? What do you mean by interrupting me in my work? How dare you?" He was huge, absolutely huge, by far the tallest man that Abraham had ever seen. One of his eyes was twitching with rage, and his face had gone all red. Seki, who was younger than Abraham, suddenly began to sob, desperately biting his lips to hold it in. "So they've brought us crybabies from Africa, have they?" bellowed the man. "That's not going to do me any good." He looked at Abraham. "You seem to have more sense than your friend. Or are you afraid of the Tsar of Russia too?" Of course Abraham was, but he was better at covering it up. He answered clearly and firmly, "No, I am not afraid." "What do you think of all this, then?" said the king, still loudly, but not quite as loudly as before, waving around the room. "And what do you think of Tsar Peter?" Abraham thought, and very carefully, putting the Russian words together in his mind first, he answered slowly, "I like these things. I like very much. I like very much to learn. And Tsar Peter, I understand why his name Peter the Great. You are very, very big man." Peter stared at him a moment, and then burst out into a huge laugh. He suddenly grabbed Abraham under the arms, picked him up, and held him so the boy's face was at the same level as his own. "So, I'm Peter the Big, am I? Well, that's true enough. But my boy, you are a big fellow yourself. As big as me, who knows? You have the heart of one of your jungle elephants." Suddenly, Abraham felt a stab of dizziness as a memory came rushing in from long ago. his father holding him up at head height when he was only a little boy, joking at how much he'd grown. Abraham might almost have wept then, but the sadness was jerked out of him as the Tsar suddenly turned him upside down and held him dangling by one leg, jiggling him up and down, until at last he turned him right way up again and put him down on the floor, gasping and dizzy. I like this boy. He has a good spirit, but he needs to learn more Russian to be useful. Get lessons organized for him. The other black boy, well, give him a fine fancy costume, and he'll look very good as a page boy with a flaming torch in his hand. Peter disappeared off soon afterward. Some trouble about a war with a fierce northern people called the Swedes, as far as Abraham could make out. The weeks went by, and every day a cheerful monk called Father Simon, with a huge bushy beard and his long hair tied in a bun at the back of his head, came and gave Abraham Russian lessons, speaking, reading, and writing. Then Tsar Peter returned. The fighting with Sweden hadn't gone very well, but it could have gone much worse, and things were quieter now. The boy spent much of his time with Tsar Peter, learning to look after his clothes and his washing things and so on. Better still was looking after Tsar Peter's pens and papers and maps and account books, his books about nature and about buildings and about machines, his drawing paper and his woodwork tools, all sorts of interesting things that were fun to peek at, and generally running around fetching and carrying. It couldn't have been more different than living and working in the Sultan's palace, where the Sultan, the shadow of God on earth, lived in a world apart, and Abraham never saw him, except at a distance, surrounded by his slaves and guards and officials. Peter was quite likely to play mad, scary jokes from time to time, like when he'd turned Abraham upside down. But he could also be kind and jolly and keen to explain things. For example, Peter himself showed him how the account books worked. You have a head for numbers, Abraham, my boy. I'll get that German who's supposed to be tutoring my darn fool son and give you a few lessons in mathematics. The more people I have around me who know what I'm talking about, the better. Goodness me, here's a boy fresh from the jungle who could teach these idiot people of mine a thing or two. Peter's eldest son, Prince Alexis, was 3 years older than Abraham. He was from Peter's marriage to his first wife, who, according to the gossip, he hadn't liked much. He didn't seem to like Alexis much either. Peter looked across from the account books to Abraham's face. Tell me, black boy, what would you like to do with your life? What would you like to do when you're a grown man? Abraham thought just for a minute. It was hard to explain in a language he didn't really know properly. In Ethiopia, my father's country, there are only two works, proper good works for a man. One is a farmer, and one work is a soldier. I always wanted to be a soldier like my father, but I leave my father's country and I learn new things. I also think about make things, pictures, buildings, machines, inventions. I like to make this too, if I can learn how. Peter looked at him in silence for a moment and then said, Is that so, Abraham, my boy? Well, in Russia, you can do both at once, fighting and thinking. Let's see how you get on. And when you are older, who knows? He put his hand on the boy's shoulder and sighed to himself. Ah, Alexis, if you could only learn from this jungle boy. And that's the end of chapter 11.